morning. I'm Annette Johnson, an Associate Clinical Professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Jane Addams Training Institute for School Social Work Professionals. 12 years ago, the Training Institute was developed to provide innovative, cutting-edge strategies and practices for school social work practitioners and other youth-serving practitioners. We've continued with that mission, and we are proud to present today's program, School Social Workers, Leaders in Trauma-Informed Care. The events of 2020 has heightened the need for school social workers and educators to address trauma-informed care from an equity lens. We want you to lead the way in supporting school staff to have challenging conversations with their students and each other regarding the impact of equity and race on the emotional needs of our students. Before we get started, I'd like to share a couple of housekeeping items for you today. First of all, if you have not done so, please complete the pre-survey link. It's in the chat box. Today we'll be in webinar format and you will not be able to see each other or hear one another. However, we encourage you to use the chat feature to share ideas and to connect with other attendees. I know that many of you look forward to coming to this institute to collect with colleagues who are in different school settings or different agency settings. So please use the chat box to connect and to provide resources. For questions, we encourage you to use the Q&A feature in the webinar, and the questions will be fielded to the panelists at the appropriate time. I want to just thank you to our opening speaker and our panelists. A very special thank you to our student panelist, Deanna, who you will hear from, and to her, the school social workers and her history teacher from Al Raby High School who have helped her to be here today. And a final thank you is extended to the Jane Addams Technology Team and the School Specialization Committee, who really worked so hard in planning today's institute. So again, thank you for being here on such a rainy morning, but it's one benefit of being in Zoom is that we can all be at home and listen and enjoy the rain as we enjoy this wonderful presentation today. Okay, so it's now my honor and pleasure to introduce the Dean of the College of Social Work at the Jane Addams College of Social Work here at UIC, Dean Creasy Finney Harrison is our dean, and a dean that we are very, very proud of all of her work and her accomplishments, but also her support to the faculty. Dean Harrison has an active research agenda that focuses on criminal justice, and she's particularly interested in the impact of incarceration and a community reentry on families and children. She serves on many boards and communities and committees and has published in numerous academic journals. In addition to her leadership responsibilities as dean and her research duties, she also provides leaderships and directs the Jane Addams Policy Center. Dean Harrison, we are so pleased that you will have taken out some time to be with us this morning. Dean Harrison.
Good morning, everyone. It certainly is a pleasure to say welcome. And even though I cannot see the participants, I can see that we're almost 140 strong. This has certainly been a very different and challenging year for all of us. We have started using a different, I was going to say vocabulary, but I don't think it's vocabulary, but different phrases, like you're on mute, you're frozen, can you hear me? Can you see me? And, that's been, just a part of my life for the last several months, really longer than that, a whole year. And so it will certainly be a pleasure to resume in-person social interactions. I think the way in which we've all had to operate over the past year has certainly affected us. And I see that I'm kind of stumbling over this. maybe it has affected me more than I realized. And the topic that we're going to be talking about today, trauma, is certainly very, very timely. It's timely because the way in which we have operated has really been so different and so difficult. I know for those of you who are parents and you've been homeschooling, that has been even more challenging than usual. And do know that you have my highest admiration and respect. And for all of us, whether we've been homeschooling or even some of us who've actually been going into our offices, it's been a different world. In many ways, we may not even know or realize the impact that it has had. So rather than going on and on about trauma, because I am not the keynote presenter, I am not one of the panelists, I'm going to just say how pleased I am that the School Social Work Institute has identified this as a topic for today. I want to thank Annette Johnson, who has been the leader for the School Social Work Institute since its inception. I thank all the members of the School Social Work Specialization who have worked with her in planning today's event. Certainly, many thanks to our panelists, to our tech team, and to all of you who have, I guess the appropriate term now is tuned in to be a part of today's event. So without further ado, I am going to pass the mic.
Thank you, Dean Harrison. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, Dr. Otima Doyle, who is an associate professor at the Jane Addams College of Social Work. Otima brings to academia clinical and administrative experiences with high-risk youth and their families. At Jane Addams, her research interests focus on the role of fathers and co-parenting in the reduction of youth aggression, depression, and suicide, and the development of preventive interventions within that population. Dr. Doyle is also the principal investigator of Voice in Vision study, which is a qualitative pilot study exploring the parenting experiences of African-American fathers of pre-adolescent sons at risk for developing aggressive behavior and depression symptoms. Her research has brought attention to the underrepresented perspectives of African-American fathers, to the growing scholarly discourse on the roles, needs, and influences of fathers. Again, please welcome Dr. Otima Doyle.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here with you today. And it is my honor to moderate this session. I'm looking forward to a very informative and timely discussion today. Before we do have discussions, which we will have a time for question and answer later, I wanted to just take a moment to introduce our opening presenter, Caryn Curry, LCSW, who is a social worker and mental health consultant for Lurie's Children's Center for Childhood Resilience. Ms. Curry comes to us and talks to us with almost 30 years of experience in the field. She's very well knowledgeable. Her practice includes clinical practice, program development, and management in a number of different settings, including schools. Ms. Curry has earned her bachelor's from Harvard and her master's from the School of Social Service Administration, SSA, at the University of Chicago. Her work has focused on trauma informed and healing centered systems and practices. And she is going to talk to us today. I'm very excited to listen to her talk. The topic, as Dean Harrison mentioned, is very timely, informative, and extremely important.
All right. Good morning, everyone. And Dr. Doyle, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Good morning. It is a pleasure for me to be with you all this morning, and I appreciate the invitation to talk with you for a few minutes about trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. So as I say, I want to talk a little bit about trauma-informed care in schools. and to share with you, and I'm sure it will be a reminder for some of what trauma-informed care really means. But I want to start with this quote actually from the National Association of Social Workers. I'm assuming we have predominantly social workers in our audience today. And I just want to read this quote and have us be thinking about this throughout the next 20 minutes or so that I'm with you, and then throughout the rest of the morning. The social work profession was founded in social change. Throughout the profession's history, social workers have sought to ensure that all people have equal access to the resources and opportunities that allow them to meet their basic needs. Now, over the next little while, I invite and encourage you to think about this quote and what it means for you in your role, in your school, in your agency, whatever setting, in whatever setting you serve. And I'm going to invite you to be thinking about several questions. What is your opportunity to affect change? What is your responsibility in whatever role you serve? How can you actually support kids who have been exposed to trauma and/or toxic stress? How can you support your colleagues? And as importantly as anything, how can you create and grow your spheres of influence to move the needle forward toward more social, emotional, and mental well-being and equity for all kids who are in your charge? Next slide. Now we're going to start with a brief reminder of what's so. And I know I don't really need to share this with anybody, but just to kind of set the frame for our time together, I want to just remind us of what our current landscape is now, and what we can be expecting both this summer and when school begins again in the fall. Next slide, please. Now, while our communities are increasingly opening up, as we know, there are still so many children and families who are still very much in the thick of dealing with the many and multiple layers of impact of these last 15 months or so. Let's think for a moment about the impact of the pandemic on daily life for families and for kiddos, right? Increased economic instability, dealing with illness, loss, and death. For Black and Brown communities, dealing with the disproportionalities in illness, loss, and death due to those social determinants of health that we know impact our communities in particular. Add to that the laser hot spotlight on ongoing racial and social injustices that we know have persisted for generations. Think about the policing and the deportations and incarceration that continue to happen for our immigrant and refugee communities. Think about the most recent spike in anti-Asian hatred that is impacting communities throughout Chicago and beyond. And then of course, there are just the long-standing inequities, the long-standing structural and systemic racism, and other ways in which communities and individuals are marginalized on a regular basis. Those things in and of themselves are enough, I know for me sometimes, to want to pull the cover over my head and say enough, right? But we want to also think about the particular impact on our kiddos who are living in families who are dealing with this. We know that kids have suffered learning loss this spring. We know that for some, there's been a loss of social skills due to the necessary isolation within our families. We know that there are increased mental health issues that our kids are dealing with. And I'm talking about all of our kids now, right? Increased anxiety, increased depression, increased suicidality, increased anger and rage. So many of us are experiencing a great collective trauma with the combination of the pandemic that we've been experiencing and all of the, again, spotlight on the racial injustice that many of us have been dealing with for a lifetime. And even for those who have perhaps not actually a technically experienced trauma, there's no denying that there is an intensity of stress that is pervading our lives right now that needs tending to, particularly given that for some, there may seem like there's no end in sight. Next slide, please. So as we think about this fact, we want to think about what is this going to mean for us as folks, as students are engaged in summer programs and when they return to school in the fall. We want to be clear about what is going to be called for us to give to our students in order for them to have the best opportunity possible to thrive. And we also want to remember that trauma-informed care is actually good practice for everyone. So our goal isn't necessarily to try to figure out who has been traumatized and work on fixing them. Our goal really is to increase our knowledge about what it means to be trauma-informed and increasingly what it means to be healing-centered, and then to reflect back what we know in our practice and in our advocacy to support all kids. Next slide. So first, we want to think about perspective. We want to develop or enhance our trauma lens and support our colleagues to do the same. Now, given our personal histories, our training, our own life experience, et cetera, we may bring some traditional perspectives about children's behavior and what it means to our various roles. For example, we may believe that some challenging behaviors are really only the result of some individual deficit that a youngster brings to us that has to be fixed. A perspective that suggests that when we look at a child who's struggling, we're asking the question, what is wrong with you? Now, a trauma perspective understands that challenging behaviors may actually simply be ways of coping with the experience of trauma. That may be a conscious stress response to harm, excuse me, a conscious stress response to harm or trauma that they have experienced, or it may be an automatic stress response that comes from the impact of trauma on the brain, right? And as we think through this lens, we are really acknowledging the possibility that, in fact, there's nothing wrong with the child, but something has happened to that child, and we want to know more about that. Now, increasingly, institutions and communities are being asked to consider a more healing-centered approach to supporting children who've experienced trauma. This is an approach that moves beyond both the question, what is wrong with this child and what has happened to this child, to considering, in fact, what is right with this child in spite of what he or she has experienced. Healing-centered engagement with students requires us to shift how we view trauma and its causes and how to intervene. It is strengths-based, focusing on building children's agency and focusing on helping them to envision their aspirations. It focuses much more on a collective versus an individual orientation toward healing. And it recenters the embracing of one's culture as a central feature in well-being. So at the end of the day, it suggests, as I said before, the question, what is right with this child and how can we build on that? Next slide. So our trauma-informed perspective understands that first, that trauma and toxic stress impact the brain physiologically. They impact cognitive functioning, social and emotional skill building, attachment, and emotion regulation. This perspective also embraces the fact that despite these negative impacts on the brain, there are things that we can do as social workers and professionals and things that we can support our teacher and other educator colleagues to do to help kids heal from their trauma experiences. We want to remember that the brain is plastic, which means that it can heal and grow in healthy ways, provided that we provide the experiences that children exposed to trauma need in order to heal. Our brains are responsive to repeated stimuli. So the more that we provide students who are exposed to trauma opportunities to engage in safe and healthy ways, the more we are supporting and promoting their resiliency. Recovery is real. With time, consistent and persistent effort, healthy brain functioning can be restored and developed. It's critical to know that every adult in a school building or a program that is nurturing and teaching kiddos has or can develop the agency to promote kids' healthy neurodevelopment and overall development, and as a result, support those children to heal and succeed in school or wherever they find themselves. Next slide, please. So what does this support look like? Now, although there may be some debate about the number of different critical factors to helping children who've experienced trauma, you can see here 3 that are considered among the most common: creating a safe environment, building relationships and connectedness, and supporting and teaching emotion regulation. Now, implementing these 3 pillars of trauma-informed practice relies on any and all adults in the purview of the kids with whom we nurture and support. We know that adults cannot provide these supports if we do not pay attention to our own social and emotional learning competencies, and improve our own self-awareness regarding things like our implicit biases, our own potential racism, thinking about our own cultural humility or lack thereof. So it's absolutely critical to embed culture and equity in all of the work that we do with young people and with their families. And of course, we must also always remember the importance of self-care, especially when working with those who have been experiencing trauma. And so as I look at this slide at my shop, we call this our hamburger slide, with safety, relationships, and emotion regulation as the innards, the burger and the cheese and whatever other fixin', and culture and equity and self-care being the buns, which need to be integrated throughout our work. Next slide. Now, as we know, safety encompasses more than just physical safety. Thank you. How can we as social workers provide and advocate for safety along all of these dimensions? For example, how can we support young people to have access to their basic needs, water, to movement, mindful breaks if they need that, access to food, to the bathroom when they need to go, etc. How do we create safe physical spaces for them and support our colleagues to do the same? Think about lighting in your classrooms or in your programs, understanding that kids exposed to trauma can be overstimulated by fluorescent lighting. Are there calm, safe spaces in your rooms where kids can go to calm down and re-engage in a safe way? Educationally, we know it's important to meet students where they are academically, which doesn't mean to lower our expectations, rather to acknowledge what is so in the moment. So how do we challenge students without ridiculing them or humiliating them? How do we encourage them to take risks without fear of failure or getting the answer wrong? Emotionally and behaviorally, what is it that we can do to support kids to know, for example, that there are no negative emotions, but our goal is to support them to learn how to be with all of their emotions in a responsible way, right? And support them also to engage with other youngsters and other adults socially in a way that is safe for all. How do we avoid humiliating kids in terms of how we react and respond to their behavior? We want to use positive reinforcement. We want to teach alternative desired behaviors. We want to use restorative practices. So safety is a vast dimension to think about, and it's key to trauma-informed practices. Next slide, please. Now, this quote coming up sums up really what many of us already know about the importance of relationships. So I'm just going to read this. When confronted with the fallout of childhood trauma, why do some children adopt and overcome while others bear lifelong scars that flatten their potential? A growing body of evidence points to one common answer. Every child who winds up doing well has had at least one stable and committed relationship with a supportive adult. So my question to you is, how do you develop and support your colleagues and yourselves to develop healthy relationships with your students, particularly with those whose experiences and whose cultures may be very different from yours? How do we bring in our understanding of our own privilege and again, our own bias, excuse me, into what is important in order to develop a relationship where we are seeing and hearing young people clearly and really listening to them and inviting them to lead and speak out. Next slide, please. And then in terms of emotion regulation, this really is supposed to be about teaching and promoting children to express themselves and their emotions responsibly. It's really about nurturing children to develop a healthy relationship with their emotions, and for those who have experienced trauma, to be supported to heal from experiences that are harmful. Effectively teaching emotion regulation requires us really to understand, again, different cultural norms. It requires us also to do some self-examination and some of our own self-regulation in the face of our own discomfort or feelings that may come up when we're interacting with youngsters who may be challenging to us for whatever reason. Unfortunately, the reality too often with regard to emotion regulation, as well as other aspects of social and emotional learning, is that in too many instances, it has become policing children into compliance. And there is a cultural and often a racial component to this. And it comes often out of our own discomfort, again, with challenges of being with children who express their pain and who express their anger in ways that make us uncomfortable or ways that are challenging for us to deal with, either through our own ignorance, our own discomfort, our own lack of skills. So think about how you can promote and advocate for teaching emotion regulation in a way that is equitable, in a way that honors the unique and multiple identities and cultures that each of the youngsters in your charge bring to you. To help ensure, for example, that a little 6-year-old Black girl doesn't get placed in handcuffs for having a developmentally appropriate tantrum, something that has happened in our schools. And I'm sure many of you have your own stories of your own experiences or what you've read in the news about children, disproportionately Black and brown children, are policed rather than nurtured to support them to be in their emotions in a healthy and responsible way. Excuse me. So how do you support these kids, and how do we support our colleagues and ourselves to truly understand that there are no negative emotions as well? Rather, to understand that there are tools and strategies to learn how to express ourselves and to learn how to behave in a way that is pro-social in whatever environment that we find ourselves in. And of course, that does mean for some of us code switching, but those are skills that can be taught as well, even though they shouldn't have to be. We also want to remember that there are school policies and agency policies and practices that can either create climates of healing and responsible expression for our youngsters, or exacerbate the harm that those who have experienced trauma are already feeling on a regular basis. Next slide, please. So as we move to these buttons again, right? We've talked about safety, healthy relationships, emotion regulation. Now let's talk about culture and equity. Trauma-informed care means acknowledging the fact that cultural responsiveness and equity matter. It means knowing that racism is a social determinant of health and a historic and current source of trauma for too many children and families. It's critical to consider how racism and other marginalization and inequity function in your buildings, in your school buildings, and in your agencies at a structural, systemic, and policy level. Now, some of you may be familiar with this graphic. It speaks to the reality of historic and present day manifestations of inequity and marginalization. And if you consider how this may manifest in your buildings to the detriment of your students, you want to look at all 4 of these graphics here. If you look at the one on the far left, there's a person who's been propelled far above the other 2 and far above the accommodations that are necessary to see, in this case, a baseball game. This represents privilege. Could be privilege based on race, on gender, on ability, on sexual orientation, any number of things. At the same time, we have a person who's in a purple shirt who is stuck in what looks like a large divot. This represents years and years of inherited disadvantage in the form of historical trauma and institutional marginalization, such as racism or sexism. Now, the equity graphic shows each individual getting the support that they need to see the game. But it also suggests that the extra supports that are needed because of something inherent in the individual, in this case, the individual's size. It doesn't acknowledge that there may be structures or systems like the fence that might be the root cause of the inequity. So the liberation graphic shows the ideal state, right? The ultimate goal of removing those structural barriers so that regardless of what we bring to the table inherently, regardless of our identities, regardless of our experience, all of us and all of our kids have the same access to optimal opportunities for success in school and in community. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we want to remember that the toll of working with youngsters and with families who have experienced toxic stress, who continue to experience toxic stress, and who've experienced trauma, that there's a toll that can have on us. In the midst of the challenges of our work, it may be easy to lose sight of the reason that many of us got into the work in the first place. We can lose our compassion satisfaction to compassion fatigue, a very, very real manifestation of working with folks who have been exposed to trauma. It's kind of a combination of burnout and secondary traumatic stress, which is that stress that results from helping or wanting to help someone who's been traumatized, right? And so what ends up happening is that we suffer, we as the worker, we as the supporter, our own health suffers, our relationships with others suffer, both personally and professionally. And eventually, and germane to our role as social workers and other supports, our relationships with students can be negatively impacted. And so their experiences can be negatively impacted. Next slide. And so it is critical that we be aware of what it is that causes us great stress, and that we learn how to find ways to balance the various aspects of our lives that are very stressful with different kinds of activities to ensure that we are the best that we possibly can be on behalf of the students and our colleagues and the families whom we serve. And it's also critical as part of that self-care to think about our connections. So despite the word self-care, self-care is actually communal. It is part of a culture of care that when we focus on the collective and not just on ourselves, can really leverage all of those who are in our purview, right? To be better, to be healthier, to support one another, and to get the help that we need to continue to be with the challenges that are very, very real in our lives, as we talked about at the outset. Next slide, please. So with all of that in mind, what now? And I'd like to end with this simply. Next slide, please. We want to return to the charge that we started with a little while ago and reflect on what we can do to advocate for trauma-informed and healing-centered school and other communities. What can you do to grow your leadership capacity and leverage your spheres of influences in your building, in your agencies, in your neighborhoods? How can you advocate for individual students who continue to be harmed, often unconsciously, but can nonetheless be harmed by educators and others because of our lack of skills, our lack of knowledge, our lack of understanding? How can we advocate for that trauma lens to permeate not only interpersonal and individual relationships, but the systems and structures and policies, both formal and informal, that are also defined what is happening in our school buildings and in our agencies? Whether you are in the earliest stages of your social work career or a seasoned veteran, I would like to invite you, to encourage you, and to challenge you to stay in the inquiry of what is yours to do to support all of the children and young people in your charge, and particularly those who have been exposed to trauma, and then to act, and to act again, and to act again. Our kids cannot afford to have us rest on whatever we currently know about trauma-informed care, and they can certainly not afford for us to practice without an intentional focus on equity for all. The two are absolutely linked together and are equally critical to ensuring that all of our youngsters have the equal access to the opportunity to thrive now, over the course of the summer, and when school begins in the fall. Thank you so much for your time and for listening. I do have a few resources that I can share with you. I will make sure that they become available to you, if not in the next 2 hours, then afterwards. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so very much for that important, informative, and timely talk. I'd like to open it up for questions and answers at this time. And what I would like to do first is just give you a really quick, friendly reminder that please send your questions through the chat, through the Q&A rather than the chat. We'll be monitoring the Q&A for those questions. There was a question that came in with regard to the slides. What we'll do after this is check in with the individual panelists and see whether or not they would like to share their slides. But generally, we do post the video recording of this on the School Institute's website. So you can come back and look for that. And I'm sure that we'll send out information regarding that. Okay, so there's a question that came in. It says, can you talk more about what the barriers are to building supportive relationships with students with trauma? And what should we do to build our capacity to work with them? And as she's getting ready to return, there was a comment in the chat and that she would be happy to share the slides.
Thank you so much for that question. So there are potentially lots of barriers. You're asking about barriers to the relationships. Is that correct? Am I understanding the question correctly? Okay, thank you. Okay, so there can be lots of barriers, and I think from the standpoint of thinking about equity, right, and social and emotional learning and social emotional competencies, and what can be happening within us that we're not even aware of. I lift up things such as our unconscious bias, right? So all of us, regardless of who we are, have bias and have implicit bias. It comes as a result of our early life experiences, our ongoing life experiences, and we simply react to certain things and certain people that we see and know, and certain behaviors in ways that we're not even aware of. And so it's important to, number one, acknowledge that, and then to begin to, through conversations and reading and experiencing folks who are different than us, to begin to unpack, if we can, what might be lurking beneath us that sends an automatic judgment. For example, that a young Black boy whose pants are baggy and hanging down from, hanging halfway down his behind means he's a thug, he's not smart, he's in a gang, or whatever else may come up for you. That may not include, oh, he's smart as all get out, he just wears his pants baggy, just as one example, right? Privilege can interfere with our relationships. If we don't understand the impact of our privilege on our language, for example, when we're engaging with youngsters and we express ourselves using microaggressions and say things that are harmful. Can't tell you how many times in the course of my lifetime I've had people say to me how articulate they think I am. Now, as a Black woman, that's a microaggression to me, because in my experience, there is an underlying assumption that, oh, that's not the norm. And for my white colleagues, I rarely hear that being the compliment for them. So those are a couple of examples. And I think through ongoing conversation, through ongoing reading, through our willingness to sit and be in our discomfort with adults and with students and learn from them about their experiences, we can begin to kind of drop our shoulders and let our humanity be exposed. And that is going to help us develop a trust and relationships with youngsters.
Great, thank you so much. And there's some other questions coming in that are related. So the first one is, how can we advance individual trauma, grief and loss that students have experienced while also addressing collective trauma, i.e. equity and COVID? And it's not my question, but I would add also the racial injustice that's happening.
Yes, no, that's a great question. There's kind of a line of tension there, because, we talk about the oxygen mask, right? And we have to put the oxygen mask on ourselves first in order to be able to help other people. And that actually is true. We can't be of good to other folks if we are not healthy and well. Too often in my experience of conversations of self-care, though, it stops there. And we forget, in fact, that we are community. We are a community of human beings. We are a community of school. We are a community of agency, of neighborhood, whatever. And while the European tradition really does kind of lift up that individual focuses, there are other orientations in the world that lift up the power of the collective and recognize and acknowledge that as human beings, we in fact are interdependent. There's no such thing as pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps. Somebody had to make the boots and the straps, right? And so it's about how we advocate for ourselves, but also for our colleagues and for kids in our buildings, right? It's about asking for help and being able to offer help and being able and choosing to say no when we're here. It's like, I really want to help you. I'm praying for you. I'm providing moral support. I got to do this for me right now. And then let's go in it. Let's go in it together. But it's about not leaving folks to fend for themselves, because anytime that we're leaving kiddos or other adults and families to fend for themselves, we are diminishing the impact of the power of community and of humanity. So that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about those things.
Great.
I hope I answered your question. I'm not sure I fully did.
Thank you so much. I can circle back around if they'd like to follow up. I'm going to ask another question And this came from, I can't actually see who the names of the folks that it's coming from, but I'll go ahead and put it out there. How do you initiate conversations about trauma with parents, guardians, / families who may be resistant to discuss or acknowledge previous traumas involving their child?
Yes, I appreciate that question. And I have a couple of thoughts about that. Firstly, it's not always necessary to know the specifics of someone's experience of trauma. And in fact, in this healing-centered framework that's getting increasing understanding, the emphasis really is not on getting people to talk about their trauma. Kids and families like, I'm tired of talking about my trauma. I am more than my trauma. Let's talk about how you can support me and how I can learn to grow into my agency, to develop self-efficacy, to envision a life that I can have for myself that is beyond that experience of trauma. So I want to just note that initially as an orientation that is important for us to acknowledge. Because to all, we think trauma, oh, this kid is hurting, something's wrong with this kid, they're broken. And it's so far from that. Our resilience as a community of Black and Brown folks is immense, and as a community of human beings is immense as well. So that's one orientation to speak about. The other thing I would say, though, is if you do have some specific concerns, be aware of your language. You don't necessarily have to use the word trauma all the time. Feel free, it's fine to ask how folks are doing. Ask if there's anything they'd like to share about their experience because you're interested in supporting them, being the young person or family in whatever way that they can. And then it's important to follow their lead. Folks will not share what they don't want to and are not ready to share. And in fact, we can run a risk of re-traumatizing folks if we are probing too much. So let folks know that you are available. Remain consistent and predictable in the way that you relate to them so that they can build trust. And if and when they decide and they are ready that they want to disclose something, they can do that. All of the things that we talked about in terms of key components of trauma-informed care can be done whether you or not you know the specifics of someone's exposure or experience with trauma.
Great. I thank you very much for that answer, and that insight is definitely very much appreciated and right on point. We do have a couple of more questions. However, I do need to move folks ahead because I want to be, respectful of time. So thank you so very much. We appreciate your comments and your answers to the questions.
Thank you.
What I'm going to do next is introduce our next speaker. And this is from the social work or educator perspective. So we're giving a number of different perspectives here. And our next speaker is Dr. Giesela Grumbach. Dr. Grumbach is an assistant professor as well as an active practitioner. She works at Governor State University, where she coordinates the school social work specialization. She's focused specifically on marginalized and diverse populations. She works in a number of different areas, including social legal systems, the VA system, but also the Chicago public school systems. And she's been in the Chicago public school systems for the last 10 years as a school social worker. She works with families and has gained her certificate in marriage and family therapy. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Dr. Grumbach.
Hello, everyone. I am very happy to be here, and thank you so much for that introduction. And let me just say that I've been in higher education for the past 20 years. I did work in the Chicago Public Schools for 10 years as a school social worker. All right, I need to share my screen. And today I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about, one second, about leadership. So I'd like to just share a few comments with you about leadership and then ask you a few questions for you to contemplate prior to our panel discussion. But I'd like to start by saying that what culturally responsive leadership is about is engaging in culturally humble practices and always striving to be culturally competent. And I know some people don't like that term. There's been some criticism about it, but I use the term as something that I think goes hand in hand with being culturally humble, but also as a concept that is definitely dynamic not stagnant in the least, right? And it's something that we always strive for in what we do. It is not an end destination. There's not an end point to it. So here's a quote from Teasley, and I like this. It says that the use of relationships in meeting people where they are in the workplace is a cornerstone of social work practice and highly important in creating positive school culture. School social workers are skilled in capacity building and can provide leadership in the school setting that helps to shape school culture in positive ways. So what this means is that we definitely are in the position to, as Ms. Curry reminded us, to act in trauma-informed ways and to provide trauma-informed care, but also to stay trauma-focused, right, with the things that we do. And it's not about calling out what that trauma is specifically, but it is, maybe even mentoring and displaying trauma-informed lens so that as you show your leadership skills and lead in that environment, perhaps you can convince others of the need to do the same. But school social workers, I think, definitely can be agents of change, and we really should be in the position to challenge status quo. We don't have to work in ways that just simply go along with how it's always been and do nothing to innovate and create other opportunities for the people that we serve, right? For students and their families. And definitely it's about capacity building and getting through to others through relationships and understanding context and what it is that our students need. The other thing is, and this was adapted from Almas, and it is to reach others, we have to first know ourselves, and to contact the deeper truth of who we are. We must engage in some activity or practice that questions what we assume to be true about ourselves and others. And this speaks to the importance of self-reflection. And for me, in terms of my practice, right, as a practitioner working in the Chicago Public Schools, as a family and couples therapist, a private practitioner, even in teaching, right? These are things that we have to do, and we have to do it in a disciplined way. It has to be something that is consistent and a practice that we don't grow weary in doing. And we should never feel like we've arrived, that we have so much confidence that we don't need to reflect on who we are, what we believe, and what our implicit biases may be. And Ms. Curry asked us also to consider, how do we enhance our trauma lens, right? And this is one way of doing it. One way of enhancing it is to fully understand it and to constantly query ourselves about who we are, what we believe, and how we interact with the people that we serve. This is a quote from Layla Saad, and she has written this book called Me and White Supremacy. It's one that went viral on the New York Times and the USA Today as a bestseller. It's a workbook that guides people to think about white privilege. And so people might wonder, like, how do I do this self-reflection? This is one way to do it. And one way to think about inclusion comes from this quote here. It's time to listen now to those whose voices were so underestimated and undervalued and marginalized, because they will be able to tell you what is wrong and what needs fixing. Now that's put very simply, but it's that thing that we do when it comes to even, developing programs. Do we include the people who are the end users? Do we have them in mind? Do we listen to their voices? And even youth, as working in schools, we can elevate their voices by including them and their parents in the things that we do for them and the interventions that we provide. So what can we learn from them about what truly is wrong? How do they see it? And what they believe needs fixing? And how do we help to reconcile that? So there are a few questions that I'd like to ask you, a couple of questions I want you to think about. And so maybe you can, answer these in the chat or in the Q&A. But when we think about these questions, right? So school social workers, let me just say this too, that you should be encouraged to embrace leadership opportunities wherever they exist. And so I want you to think about that. What leadership roles can you take on? Are you willing to do it? And if not, what holds you back? But here are some other questions, right? So what are you currently doing, or what have you done in the past to demonstrate leadership? And what makes you ready for leadership role? What things may you consider using or changing in the future to become more culturally responsive, or to act or um, operate from an equity-minded and inclusive lens? And then what difference does leading from a culturally responsive framework make, right? What difference does it make in terms of being equity-minded? So I want you to think about those things. And if you can make note of those in the chat, that would be great. This is a slide just to remind us of the core value of social justice and what we do as social workers. And this is one of the grand challenges of social work. So school social workers really are in a unique position to raise issues of equity in schools and to challenge the system, especially in ways that we see it may help to maintain disproportionality, right? So what things are we doing to cry out, right? Ms. Curry talked about a 5-year-old who's doing something that's developmentally appropriate, having a tantrum and being taken out in handcuffs. And so what do we do about that? How do we lend our leadership in ways that help to buck up against that system, to challenge the status quo and to say, this is not going to become the new norm for us. I want you to see our humanity and to see the humanity of the children that we serve and to see it for all of them, right? School social workers can educate staff, create or serve on equity teams, strengthen contacts with families, and raise important questions about equity, both formally and informally. And I'd like to give you an example. So I heard of a social worker who was working on an equity team. And one of the things that she did was, as she was on a committee for hiring within that school district, she advocated to have parents on that committee as well, and to then pay them for their expertise. And so that is sort of putting your money where your mouth is, right? And really thinking about how you can do something from that in a culturally responsive way and in a way that supports equity and inclusion. So here's just a few other things I want you to keep in mind when we think about leadership. And one is, and before I get to this, let me just say that it's also important for school social workers to increase their visibility within the school, within that school setting, and maybe even within the district, right, as appropriate. But you need to be seen and you have to be visible and be able to speak up, advocate on behalf of others, and show your leadership qualities. And I think that we as school social workers, we as social workers, period, are in a unique position. We definitely have a unique skill set that helps us to understand the context of the clients that we serve. And we are in a unique position in our ability to collaborate with others and to know how to build those important relationships. But here are some other things that I want you to consider when it comes to thinking about leadership. And that is to keep an open mind to embracing some of those opportunities that may come your way. You have to always actively discover and challenge your own biases. Why do you think the way you do? And how do you interpret a student's behavior? What is it that the student needs? Do you look at the student and somehow ascribe that to who they are as a person? Or do you look at it based on the behavior? And how do you convince others to do the same within that setting? We definitely have to collaborate with diverse others. It's always important to do that. And it's not enough just to do it maybe at an NASW conference or a school social work conference, but we need to do it in terms of our own professional and personal networks and in other ways through culture culture, diversity, activities, the arts, in a lot of different ways, right? The more we do to expose ourselves to diverse others, the better it is. But then also to collaborate with diverse others, even around issues of leadership, right? And working on teams and learning how to work with people across professions, right? We also have to assess the workplace for inclusivity, right? So sometimes we can give lip service to it and we can write about it, but is it actually something that is done in practice? And that's the most important thing. And so how do we assess that? The other thing is be willing to share your skills and leadership roles. It may mean volunteering for something where you're able to demonstrate your leadership, but it's definitely something that we have to do. We need to embrace opportunities to take on those leadership roles. And as school social workers, I think we should definitely do that. And we should be the forerunners of promoting issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion, trauma-informed care, all of that. So how can we become those forerunners and become the people that others rely on for that kind of information? So in doing that, we can't just put our heads down. We have to be visible and we have to step up to the challenge. These are, and you'll get, I guess, the slides. I'll make sure Professor Johnson has them so she can share them with you. But these are some videos on unconscious bias. If you click here, I'm sorry, and it's 17 minutes long. This one is on stereotypical hiring practice. Again, it's about leadership, also thinking about, the way in which we do this and how can we do it from a more equitable position. And then this is something you can look up online. There's this activity called the Harry window, and it is something that is used in business and leadership, and it helps you to get to know diverse others in a very different way. And so that's an activity you can look up as well. And these are the resources. And I'm trying to be mindful of my time so we have enough time for the other panelists. So I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grumbach. Now this is that was our first speaker for our panel. And so I'm going to hold questions till the end of the panelists. But certainly if you have any questions for Dr. Grumbach, please feel free to put it in the Q&A and I will bring them back up once we get to the Q&A section for the panelists. So what I'd like to do right now is to introduce our student panelists, Ms. Deanna Jackson. Ms. Jackson is a rising junior at Al Raby High School. She grew up on the west side of Chicago. She's very ambitious and has a lot of very interesting, a lot of interests, right? So drawing, listening, building a cosmetology business. She's looking to go to UCLA after graduation, and she's even considering a career in social work. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Ms. Deanna Jackson.
Hey, everybody, all the social workers, panelists, to all the special people here in this meeting. My name is Deanna Jackson. I live in Chicago, grew up on the West Side. I'm 16 years old, a rising junior at Al Raby. I have a lot of interests: art, public speaking, student voice committee, basketball, volleyball, sports. Also going to UCLA, as she said, in business, entrepreneurship. I also do hair, growing up cosmetologist business. And working with summer programs and summer jobs. I feel that COVID impacted me and my peers by us losing a lot of people who we love the most, which would be family, friends, and other important people to us. It stopped us from having fun, from being around people, being social. It interrupted us from living a life that we live on a daily basis. Being used to wearing a mask, like daily rituals we now get used to. It also normalized us to washing our hands more, using hand sanitizer, keeping 6 feet distance from everybody, being vaccinated, just things that we have to do now that are different from how we lived before. And also being able to disseminate information, like a lot of causes about like myths about vaccines, about how it could kill us or do something to us, basically. But really, we had to like keep that information away because it impacted us negatively more. So we would have to like keep our mind off certain things too because it impact us on a different way it should. Um, Also with negative and positive ways about remote learning. So the positive ways I would say is computer skills with email, learning how to email. Also digital tools, learning how to work a computer. Um, Typing, learning how to type, learning how to speak, learning how to press certain buttons and how they work. And also being organized, because you know on the computer it's like um everything is put in its own place. Learning how to go from tab, learning how to download things and share it. Um, Learning what things tell you on the computer. Also with communication with our students and teachers, it was like a more so computer connection. Like we could always communicate 24/7 with emailing them, Google chat, with just being able to communicate more than being in school, coming every other day. And with being on the computer, you can email them anytime or talk anytime, whether if it's work, whether if it's family problems, no matter what the situation is. I would say the negative is like sitting in front of a computer for 5 hours plus with hurting your eyes, with being exhausted and tired and willing to give up, because we have free will. Like knowing that we can't do it, with being on the computer for a long time, it made me exhausted. It made me feel like I can do it. But I thought like I need this, I need to get myself together to be able to learn on the computer because it's hard. Being able to learn in school and on the computer is two different things, two different perspectives. Um, Also being comfortable, like being too comfortable could get carried away. You know, waking up, being in your bed, sleeping on the computer, not having that much energy. It was most definitely a lack of energy going on with everybody logging in on school and nobody was really talking. Also with Wi-Fi issues, which led to lack of learning time because we didn't really have enough time because of the Wi-Fi messing up. A lot of people had Wi-Fi issues at home, and we definitely didn't have like a lot of Wi-Fi around other places. A lot of people wasn't always at home, so there was always a way, so it would be even more hard. I would also say like being able to speak out of your comfort zone. Some people don't usually speak. They would be scared to speak within school and with being on the computer. But I just feel like those were really the problems and the positive effects with remote learning. Um, with how social workers and teachers and staff could really help us with this remote learning and trauma, I would say like they could really help with mental problems. Basically like having conversations with us and helping us learn more and how it could affect and just like basically talking to us. I would say school could be an escape, like us being back in school. Some people usually have problems at home and we would need to like talk to our social workers for them to get us in a comfort zone and make us feel comfortable and talk to us where they settle our problems. But with that, it was kind of hard. And not everything has to be about talking about trauma. Like it could be about having fun, sports, also like friendships, relationships, hobbies, things we like to do, get us distracted from our problems and things we going through with remote learning. Also with student rights. Now, even though We still at school, we not at home, we also have student rights. So like student voice, get us like making our school a better environment for everybody, for teachers, for students, to hear us, hear our voices. I will also say like having students not only having these meetings, a panel meeting for trauma or more meetings about every other subject, but more students being able to attend these meetings, because not only us just talking about trauma and how we could solve it, but having students listen and help others. Like me, I had trauma, but now I'm improving on my trauma. But also, I can also teach and talk to other students about their trauma to help them, not even just their trauma, but improvement. Being helping them be able to move from feeling some type of way or what they going through. Just get them, just not making them feel, closed down and thinking about so much, but get that man off so much things to help them with other things. And I would say just understanding us more and getting us adjusted to things, because we getting being back in school is kind of different. My thing was like a lot of people not used to being 6 feet apart. We just learning to adjusting back, going back to school and being able to learn being on a computer, like having a lot of understanding our expectations with being at home and at school. So I just feel like that that's just that's just what we learning and what we're going through now. And I just feel like that we should take lead and have our voices. So I just thank y'all for having me here.
Thank you so much, Deanna. I think I can speak for all of us when I say we really appreciate having you here. Your voice is really, really important, and you're being an educator and a teacher to us. So I'm humbled and I appreciate everything that you have to say. What I'd like to do now is move forward to the next panelist, and our final panelist, and we will again have Q&A at the end of this with all our panelists, including our opening presenter, Ms. Curry, so that if you have questions, just a friendly reminder to drop them in the Q&A box rather than the chat box. So I'd like to introduce Ms. Celia Colón. Ms. Colón uses her unique life experiences and really works as an advocate for families. She is a passionate community leader. She is a mentor. She's a mother, a grandmother. She advocates and supports legislative policies that support those who are re-entering society. She's a speaker and an educator. And so she speaks frequently at conferences, at churches, in jails, and she's also appeared on TV and radio. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Ms. Colón.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for creating this space, this very important conversation and topic. I'd like to shout out Dr. Grumbach and Ms. Curry for some of the jewels that you dropped a little earlier and the knowledge that you're sharing here on this panel. So my name is Celia Colón. I am a system survivor. As she told you, I am a mother, a grandmother. I am a humble community servant. I am someone who am a survivor of multiple layers of harms and trauma. And I've been serving my community for the last 20 years. I'm open to any questions that you might have. Did you want me to talk about my personal experiences, or just the topic that we spoke about in regards to how social workers can be, I guess, more engaged with the community?
That would be great. The second.
Okay. Sure. So with my experience, my unique experience, somebody who, like I said, have survived multiple layers of trauma, who've seen multiple different counselors and social workers, to try to assist me with overcoming or dealing with some of these traumas. One of the things that I think resonates with me is when I first started trying to seek help is that there's a secret code or there's a social worker code of some sort that doesn't allow you guys to be completely human with us, right? You're not supposed to share like your personal issues or your personal life, not too much with your clients. And I think that right there is a huge flaw. For people of color, I can only speak for myself and my community. If you are not someone who doesn't look human to me, right? At that moment, you're talking to me, you're trying to find out what's wrong with me, you're trying to give me advice. But if I feel that you do not understand my path or where I come from, how am I supposed to open up to you? How are we building trust? If I come into a room and I feel like I'm the only one being judged, I'm the only one that has flaws, there's going to be a disconnect right away. If I, for 1 second, think that you do not understand my path in any capacity, why would I share my trauma with you? Why would I re-traumatize myself and entertain you? And that's something that I felt when I first started seeking counseling and stuff. I felt like I was just entertainment for fellows that would come in to talk to me because they were re-traumatizing me. Sometimes, people of color, we're suffering and we're grieving in the office, outside the office, in society. We have generational harms that no one really likes to talk about. And these are the things that we need to talk about. So, as myself being somebody that is formerly incarcerated, who had my record sealed, I always say I'm not a returning citizen. I'm just as impacted because I still don't have all my civil rights back. I still can't run for office. I still can't own a gun. I still can't work at the school, even though my record has been sealed. And this creates generational harm. And what I mean by that is that our children who unfortunately, have a parent that's been tied up with the legal system, they eventually carry and pay for our debts with their lives, their innocent lives. And what I mean by that, I'll share an example. In 8th grade, a couple years ago, my daughter graduated, and they wouldn't let me be a parent. They said, due to my background, I couldn't chaperone, I couldn't be a part of the festivities and the parties that were going to happen. And at that moment, I said, no, you're not making my daughter wear my number. She wasn't even a thought in my mind when I was 18 and went to prison. And how dare you? How dare you share that story with her? What if I never shared that with her? She wasn't even a thought in my mind when I was 18. I'm 45 years old now, So for me, it was like, who is going to help her with counseling when she's being bullied or being, talked about because she has a mother with a record, right? And I told them, are you guys going to help her? Are you guys going to, pay for the years and years of counseling that it's going to create and the chaos that it's going to cause within the school? And I fought with the school. I threatened the school. My kids go to a Catholic school. I called people at the archdiocese, gave them a piece of my mind and asked them if they knew the Bible, right? Because Jesus came out to sinners. And so these are the things that I talk about, generational harms. I have a nephew who tried to become a part of the FBI. But because he had family members who had previous run-ins with the justice system, the young man was denied. Why should he be denied a career and a life that he wants to create for himself based on generational harms, again, paying with his life for things that he shouldn't be paying for? For me, I love social workers. I believe that you guys are the bridge. You guys are the most compassionate people out there because you guys serve with your hearts. Most people get into this work because you guys have been hurt or seen the hurt and want to do something to stop it. I do believe building a safer community is a community issue. Like, we should all be working towards this, right? A lot of people don't think about the social structural harms that are done to people, the emotional harms. Everybody always thinks about the action items when people come home or people are involved with trauma. It's not always about the action items. Sit down and just listen to people. I mean, really listen to people. They'll tell you what they need. They'll tell you what they want. Again, with Dr. Grumbach said, those, when she said people like me should be at the forefront, we should be directing policy. Those closest to the pain and the problem were also closer to the solution, but furthest from the resource and power. And we know what we need. We've been known what we need, right? But I always tell people, communities that I live in, I come from the South Chicago community. There's so much structural violence that's in plain sight that no one really talks about or places responsibility back on society. And what I mean by that, if anybody's familiar with the southeast side of Chicago, Commercial Avenue, all my stores close down 6 to 7 o'clock with gates, lock and key. Liquor store stays open till 12 on weekdays, till 2 on weekends. Pawn shop stays open till 12 o'clock on weekdays, till 2 on weekends. Before the COVID, the plasma shop, the plasma store, right? The plasma center that takes our people's plasma, I say take our people's souls, used to stay open till 9 p.m. That's structural violence in my community that nobody talks about. Like, them kind of structural violence doesn't exist in Naperville, doesn't exist in, Schaumburg. It's about changing our communities. It's about really empowering people and listening to not just the person you're serving, but that whole family. I myself have a non-for-profit. It's called God Giving Others Dreams. I serve women coming home from jails, treatment centers, and prison. And when I serve the woman coming home, we have what's called a We Win Welcome Home care package. We give them, clothes and all the hygiene products, but we also do the most important thing that a lot of people don't do. We assess their home. How many people live there? Because in the state of Illinois, 27,000 people are released every day, every year from Illinois Department of Correction into 5 communities that exist on the south side and the west side. And I live in one of them neighborhoods. You have to understand our economics haven't changed. You have to understand people living in these neighborhoods cannot support another adult coming home. People fight over laundry soap, over dish soap, petty things, but yet people are fighting for these things because we're fighting to survive. We're not thriving, we're surviving. There's food deserts in our communities. If I didn't have all these little mom and pop little Mexican stores in the community, we'd have food deserts, structural violence. And the thing is, our kids deal with this on a daily basis. Our families deal with this on a daily basis. 2021, we all talk about wanting to help people. Chicago is now this trauma-informed city, but yet there is not one curriculum in any elementary school or high school that is written to deal with how to heal from trauma. In the schools, I work inside the juvenile detention center. I've talked to 202 students the last time I spoke, and I don't care if it's the girls or the boys. One of them, they'll all say the same thing. Nobody listens to them. At home, the parents we're struggling to survive. So parents are working 2 or 3 jobs. The teachers take it as you're not being responsible, that you don't care, that you don't want to be involved. They're not even asking why we can't be involved. In my community, in the South Chicago community, there's a school that has 402 students with only 8 allowed parent volunteers due to backgrounds. In the state of Illinois, there's 42% of Illinois of people have records. So that means, guess what? There's so many children that are being destroyed due to these records, right? Because now they're given these generational harms without even asking for them. These are the kind of harms that destroy a community. When you serve a person, you have to serve that whole house. So we offer services not just to the woman coming home, but the whole family. The whole family needs counseling. The whole family has been impacted. The whole family is going through this, and I think that when we stop to focus on what, on just that one person that you're serving, that person's attached to so many people and so many multiple layers of harm. And, for me, it's about let's healthier people create healthier lifestyles that create a healthier community. I've been going back behind the wall since 2001. I still talk to the women in prison via Zoom. Next week, I'm online with Educator. The following week with Logan, I'm in with the Audi Home. I still talk to these people all the time. And I listen to their cries, right? I listen to them say, well, no one wants to help me. And the thing is, we all know, right? As social workers, as educators, as people that have been in this field, number one thing that you can read from any book written by any psychologist or doctor, trauma will screw up your life. No one can tell you how you're going to heal from it, when you're going to heal from it, right? And people that are suffering from trauma are not coming to look for help. You have to go to them. And that's one thing that, for me, my heart for social workers is that you guys come to us. You guys meet us where we're at in some scenarios, right? And for me, that's it. That's it. Like with my outreach and my non-for-profit, we serve the people. We come to them. Because when you have a village of people that show up at your house with no disparities, no judgment, just with tools and resources and things to help you move forward and say, hey, we're here for you emotionally, spiritually, we're praying for you, for your success. And you got this, right? You got a village supporting you. It changes things for people. It changes the game. It changes hope. It changes possibilities. It's about creating opportunities. We're fighting for equity. We're fighting for, social justice reform. At the end of the day, things are moving in the right direction. But until we can get real with America and decide that this Bill of Rights and the the Constitution was written at the end of the day by white slave owners. And it doesn't reflect the United States that we live in today, a very diverse, rich society. We're just pivoting off of something that shouldn't even exist. And that's why a lot of these structural harms and violences are in plain sight. We're not saying the people of today, created these, but other people did, and they're still there. Violence creates money at the end of the day. Violence is a moneymaker. People talk about criminals and criminals this, criminals that. Well, who created the criminal, right? We know environments will either make you or break you. So what are we doing as a society to change things, to create a safer community, to stop the violence, to stop? What we do is we pour into people. We radically show up. We start with love. We start with no judgment. We start listening, really listening. Because when you start talking to people, they'll tell you in the first 5-10 minutes what they really need. We just got to listen. And for me, I think that the more that we remove the masks from the social workers, remove the masks from the psychologists who don't want to be emotionally involved with their clients, then you'll be able to serve more. You'll be able to get to somebody. You'll be able to build a trust like you never believed, because I can't trust you if I feel that you don't understand me. You don't have one clue of what I'm going to go through emotionally, physically, spiritually, right? It's a ride. We have to think that everything is based on emotion. For me, my job has been to help people heal since I've been home, helping them on their own healing journey, because no one talks about the emotional scars, the social scars, the harms that are there forever, right? And yes, we can go through counseling, we can, go through all these therapies, but there's some traumas that will scar your soul that you will never, ever, ever be able to forget. I don't care how much counseling you have, how much help you have. It's just things that scar your soul and never leave you, but also give you strength. I believe there's treasures in the darkness as well, right? There's so much wisdom that comes from when you're in that space of pain and your back is against the wall and the only thing you know how to do is survive. And that's when you learn things that help you and help generations to come.
Thank you so much, Ms. Colón. I just want to start off by saying thank you. Thank you for your powerful words. Thank you for sharing your insight of your lived experiences. And also thank you for just exemplifying for us the importance of your voice and how integral it is to solutions, right? As kind of a broader representation of, part of the theme is that we need to hear from people who are really experiencing these oppressive acts. And so being able to understand and get solutions from the community and from people themselves is really important. And so thank you so much for showing us how important that is. I want to open it back up, and I'm going to ask all of the panelists to please turn on their camera. So we'll do a Q&A session with the whole panel. And so if you do have any other questions that you'd like to stick into the chat, please do so now. Ms. Curry, please, we would like for you to join us as well. Thank you so much. And so I'm going to, we have a number of questions. We'll try to get through as many as we can in the time that we have allowed. And I'll try to make sure that each of you get a question as well. Deanna, can I start with you? There's a question from the audience, and it says, and anybody can also, I'm directing it to Deanna, but certainly you guys are welcome to chime in. How can we engage students as leaders during this critical time?
I would say programs would be the best option as like a group thing. Being able to like having students volunteer to talk, let go, and the people who want to, like students who really want to talk and support, gather us together, make a program, have more meetings, and just talk and have fun, enjoy each other, and learn from each other also.
Did anybody else want to add any thoughts to that question? And if
I would like to say that if we would give students more leadership roles by really making them the people in charge of the policies and the things that they want to have, because only they know. Like, I feel so sorry for kids nowadays, right? They got to deal with all the violence that we were hidden from as teenagers because of the internet, right? So we have a lot of kids dealing with mental health issues that they don't like to talk about, but they need to realize that they're not alone. And a lot of us are in silos and think we're alone. So I think that there's so many pathways to recovery. There's not one way, but music, arts, theater, all of these things are forms of therapy, yoga, meditation, exercising within sports. Everybody is not an athlete. You have to find things that really interest those students to get them to open up, to really talk about what's happening behind their doors. And I think that really letting them take lead, they know what they need. We just need to support them and let them run the policy. And we're just the supportive village that stands behind them and make sure that everything's in place so that they flourish.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Well, may I weigh into that as well? Another thing is to engage your students in critical service learning, because that's something that does activate youth voice. You can use it as a facilitator, as a school social worker, and it gives them leadership responsibilities from the very beginning. And it enables them to examine critically some of the oppressive systems that they participate in, or that they're a part of. They get to critically examine that and then think about ways that they want to engage in civic activities to help address whatever issue they highlight, right, in the work that they do through critical service learning. So that's one way.
Thank you so very much. Ms. Curry, did you want to say something?
I did want to just add one more thing, and that is to be mindful that all leaders are not represented by good grades, right? And so there's leadership everywhere among students, and it is our job to facilitate and seek it out, and not to assume that only our A students and our student council members can be leaders.
Thank you so much. And I also want to elevate a comment that's in the chat here. I'm mostly monitoring the Q&A, but I did see this pop up, and it was kind of in line with something I was thinking about, because in the community-based research, we'll do things like advisory boards. And so sometimes we'll do a parent advisory board, but a student advisory board, but it looks like there's an equivalent here. And so Rebecca Francis said, anyone who works in CPS, many schools have student voice committees consisting of students who are passionate about elevating student voices. And so if your school doesn't have, and it goes on, the comment goes on, but you can read it. And if your school doesn't have one, anyone can become a facilitator. So I thought that was a pretty kind of helpful comment there that I wanted to elevate in our conversation. Ms. Curry, since you're showing on my screen, can I direct the next question to you? The question is, thank you. What are common misconceptions about trauma? How can we combat these misconceptions and communicate more effectively in and with schools?
Wow, thank you for directing that to me. That's a big question. Misconceptions about trauma. I think one huge misconception is that kind of going back to that trauma lens, it means that something is wrong with the individual. And typically what goes along with that is like there's something inherently wrong. Even as we acknowledge that something may have happened, it's like something wrong with you that I have to fix. So I think that's one misconception. I think there's a misconception about a misconception that minimizes the impact of trauma on our brains, like physiologically, right? Little ones who have been exposed to toxic stress, their brains are physically smaller. They have fewer neurological connections than other little ones, you know, same age who don't experience trauma. And so the trajectory without intervention and support, as has been so eloquently talked about today, can be pretty bleak. And so when a youngster is acting out, so to speak, that there is a myth that it is something to be taken personally, and that student is thinking about how can I give Miss So-and-so a bad day. Now, certainly there are some students who fall into that category, but there are lots of kids whose behaviors are absolutely an automatic brain response to some re-expression of their trauma, something that has triggered them. Then the flip side of that, in terms of another myth, and then I'll leave it here, is that the trajectory is necessarily negative for folks who have been traumatized, that in fact, the brain cannot heal, that in fact, there's nothing that we, whether it's we mental health professionals or we anyone, there's nothing that we can do, or there's only so much that we can do to support healthy development. And that is also a huge myth. I know there was more to the question. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering what the second part was.
The second part, and let me scroll down and grab it. How can we combat these misconceptions and communicate more effectively with schools and families?
Yeah, and I'll just say, I won't take up too much space. I'll just say simply, it's up to us to educate ourselves, right? And there's plenty of, you know, trauma is in vogue now, to be honest with us, right? It's been around for a long, long time, but it's kind of sexy in some spaces to talk about trauma, people's trauma experience. So the good news about that is that there's a lot of great literature that's out there about trauma. I think we need to seek voices that are not typically heard. Again, most often non-white voices who have wonderful and important critical things to say about the experience of trauma in communities that are not white. And to Ms. Colón's and Deanna's experience and conversation, we need to listen to people who have lived experience and let them lead us in so many ways.
Thank you so much. And I think we have a couple of other really good questions here. I'm going to ask one that has two parts to it. It's directed to Dr. Grumbach, and I think maybe after she answers, there may be others that may want to speak to this question. So the question is a two-part question. It says, how does one step up to the plate of leadership without causing friction between teachers and yourself as a school social worker? I feel some teachers may feel a social worker is adding more to their plate. And that's the first part. The second part is, how does a social worker in a building with a high caseload, having to be responsive to crisis situations and with very limited time, still have the time to lead and start various initiatives?
Okay, so I'll take a stab at this. And so I think we have to be mindful of creating supportive relationships with teachers. And definitely, we do not want to do anything that causes a chasm between what we do and how we support them, right? So we have to strive to be collaborative first. I think we have to build a sense of we, right, within the building. We have to do teamwork and try to help stay focused on the students and their families and what the school system itself needs in order to do the best possible jobs we can do. And, you know, a long time ago at an NASW conference, I did a workshop on preventing burnout in the workplace. I had a ton of people in there, probably a lot of them from DCFS, but I think this would be something that we definitely could have for the overworked school social worker, right? And, you know, I think it's a matter of figuring out how to do like a cost benefit analysis to talk to and persuade the people above you to get the support you need. And you have to be able to advocate for yourself even before you know how to advocate for others, right? And so I think that's a part of leadership as well. And so another way of doing things might be to think innovatively about how you get the support you need until you get your system to weigh in and give you what you need. And so for me as a school social worker, I took on several interns. So when I had that caseload that was going and I was at one school, when I had a caseload that was going so busy that I didn't have time for lunch, I figured I had to think about a different way of doing things. And so that meant I had to pull some other folks in, get them involved. You have to be willing though to make sure you are able to give back to those student interns, right? Because they're there to learn and to become good practitioners. So I made sure I did that, and I had supervision with them regularly and an open door policy. But when you do that, then maybe you can implement even some tier 1 interventions to start talking about and educating not only teachers, staff, and administrators, but people within the communities as well, and parents. It would be great to have a whole bunch of parents here listening to Miss Curry and Miss Colón and even Deanna, right? Miss Jackson. It would be great to have, you know, a ton of parents here to be able to do some of this even as a tier 1 intervention. And so I think that I'm hoping that that helps, but it is something that's going to be incremental. You have to push for it. And I will tell you this too, that at one school where I was in particular, it was a new principal. He brought on his own people. When you put your head down and you do your work and you do a good job, people start to notice. One of his trusted faculty members was able to advocate on my behalf, so I got the resources that I needed. And then once he got to know me, then I started getting put in leadership positions. I was invited to, you know, participate in the overall school team, working on the school improvement plan, other things. I became, once he got to know me, more integrated into that system, right? And so sometimes it comes by invitation as well, based on what you do and how much you're willing to do and step up and even volunteer to do at times. I hope that helps.
Could I add a bit to that? Thank you so much for that, Dr. Grumbach. And I just, yes, to everything that you said. There are just a couple of things that came to mind for me as well. And I think, and more to the first part of your question about kind of, I heard it as kind of getting along, right? So doing what's necessary, but also doing it in a collaborative way. And I think, you know, as I think about the landscape in which we're all living and the need that is out there, that's so huge. There is a time, I think, when we have to be thoughtful about some decisions that we want to make with regard to our personal integrity, right? When we know something to be true, and what it is that we are willing, and I'm not suggesting this is easy in any way, and it's people's personal decision. That said, there is a decision to be made about what level of risk am I willing to take to speak what I know to be a truth, right? And so I just invite us all into that space of inquiry for ourselves, because our kiddos and our communities need us, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing, and I don't think you mentioned this, Dr. Grumbach, but the notion of mentors and seeking out allies early on without anything going wrong. Like, how do I get to know who are my allies in this space? Who can I turn to as a peer, and are there mentors that I have or can create for myself, so that if and when I decide to take that risk, I can get some guidance perhaps about how to do it and some support in the aftermath.
Thank you so very much for that. Did anybody else want to speak to that at all? Okay, so what I want to do is, give me 1 second. Let me pull my questions back up. Okay, and so the last question I think that I'd like to ask, and again, Ms. Curry, you're on my screen, so I'm going to direct it to you, and anybody can join in if you'd like. But how can school social workers elevate the voices of families and communities?
I actually think I might be the least qualified person to answer this question as a person who has had minimal and long time ago experience in school. So I'd like to defer to other folks, and then
That's
I
fair.
can add anything that I might have to add.
That's fair. I think maybe Dr. Grumbach would answer that for us, and then maybe you can talk more generally about that as well, not necessarily in that setting, but just elevating voices more generally. Yeah.
So could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
How can school social workers elevate the voices of students, families, and communities? And actually would love to hear from Celia and Deanna as well.
Yeah, so I think by creating that sense of community and inviting parents and community members and students in to some sort of forum, right, where you deal with a particular issue. So you could create a forum, you could do it by way of a World Cafe. There are a lot of different innovative ways that you can invite people in to express themselves and to elevate their voices. So yes, to get it directly from them.
And I believe elevating the voices comes from you guys being able to gain trust with us, right? That you're serving, and then bringing that information to the people that are in charge of policy, the elected officials, right? Advocating for us, because you guys will know our truths, and maybe we'll be scared to talk in front of these people with titles, but we're okay with talking to you, our social worker, who now we have a trusted relationship with. So you're like the person carrying our torch at that moment when that person can't speak from themselves. You become a very, very vital part of change. And if there's things going on that you know that need to be implemented in that school, then demand funding for that, right? It's time for us to start demanding a healing space within our schools, within our communities, within our nation. Like, as a society, we all know that no matter what, we're all going to face some kind of adversities, some kind of pains that are just going to change our lives and our directions in ways that we don't even know. So therefore, having the proper interventions, having the proper resources, having the I know where to go if I run into this problem is so important. Just like there's liquor stores on every corner of my neighborhood, I wish there was empowerment centers. I wish there was resource centers that stayed open till midnight, things that really truly serve the community. All of these politicians, when it's time to get the vote in, they spend millions and millions of dollars. Like, why couldn't you just put a resource center in my community? And that will make me vote for you, because you're putting the money where it's needed. Invest in my community, invest in my education, invest in my medical care and my well-being, like invest in those things. And that's what we need to be pushing for. And I think that when we can't be in that space and there's other people standing in our space, I feel like for me, myself personally, I go to a lot of spaces where I'm always an educator, that I have to bite my tongue sometimes, because sometimes people say things that you're like, whoa, right? And you have to pray and then be in a place of as an educator, right? And sometimes you don't want to be in that space. Sometimes it gets heavy, and it's like, wow, like they really don't have the concept or understand. But I think the more open we are to really just looking at each other as human beings, and that we all are all in this journey together, we are all connected, and really realize that in order for you to live happy and be in a safe community, then that means you have to build everybody around you. That means you have to build into your community. That means you have to serve each other unapologetically, instead of, a lot of the times, and I'll speak from experience, a lot of people don't like to go in and tell our family or our counselor or our social worker that I can't do it today. I'm breaking, I'm falling apart. And people need to know it's okay to break. It's okay to fall apart. It's okay not to be okay sometimes, right? We do it all the time, but we do it in silence. We do it alone. We do it behind closed doors, because we've been taught as a society it's shameful to be vulnerable. And if anything, that's one of the most courageous things to do, is to be vulnerable, to show people that I am human, I bleed just like you, and I hurt just like you. So until we can come to that space where we value human life and not put judgment on titles and economical status, like when we change that, that's when we're changing dynamics. When we really pour into people unapologetically, instead of calling, the police on the lady next door because she has 5 kids, her kids are always dirty, their nose is running, they're in and out looking like they're not supervised. Knock on her door and ask her what she needs. Knock on her door and ask her, how can I help you, sis? I see you're struggling. What can I do for you? We don't need other people to show up. We need each other to show up for each other. That's how things get changed. It's because at the end of the day, these structural harms, they're not going to change overnight. They've lived in our society for generations, right? So until those things go away, and I don't see them leaving anytime soon, because again, violence is a moneymaker, right? They're going to be there. And it takes us, people, to just touch another person's heart and, just radically show up for them and be what you need and they need at that moment.
Thank you so very much. You guys have really, I think, brought a lot of insight and important information to this. We could talk for a long time, and certainly there's other questions. Unfortunately, though, we're out of time and I have to move us forward, but I just want to say I really appreciate all of you guys. I see claps coming in the chat box, so thank you.